morning. Thank you, Tom and Simon, for agreeing to come on my webinar series entitled Asking the Hard Questions. What legacy are we leaving our young? And I suppose my topic today, what I'm honing in on, is digital technology in education and its impact on our young in formation and the far-reaching impacts for them in their lives and in their careers, and I suppose with their health, etc. So my name is Teresa Hand-Campbell. I'm founder director of THC Consultancy. I work these days as an occupational psychologist, a coach and mediator against a backdrop of 30 years experience in leadership roles in education. And Tom, I became familiar with your work as Dr. Tom Butler of UCC, one who has done extensive research into the area of digital technology in education, its upsides and its downsides, and you have extensive portfolio of research to your name, and you garnered something of 8.7 million in research to date, and more to come, I hope. So thank you very much for taking time out of a very busy schedule to join us here today. Simon comes to us from the coalface of education, principal of an Educate Together in Carlow Town, comes from a strong background in technology to master's level, has a number of research papers to his name, and has guided many postgraduate studies and students and educators in the rollout of digital technology in education. So thank you very much for joining me. And perhaps I suppose I will start off with you, Tom, and ask you to maybe introduce yourself and give a brief overview of the extent of your research and your key research findings that we should sit up and listen to today. Just a broad overview, and we'll get deeper in as we go.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Teresa. Well, as Teresa mentioned, I've been a technologist since 1974, since joining academia in UCC in the mid-90s, I've been researching the use of digital technology, and more latterly, the use of artificial intelligence. However, I'm also an educator, and I suppose the genesis of my interest in digital technology in education, and I was an innovator from the get-go in this, in the mid-90s, by the way, was the fact that I noticed a change in my students, in their ability to comprehend, to problem solve. It was a general problem that I saw increasing over the years, and when I attended conferences and spoke with colleagues internationally, they too noticed a change in their students. And it took me a long while, and what triggered it was Nicholas Carr's book, The Shallows. And I realized that maybe technology was at the root cause of this. It was, philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn called it a puzzle, a scientific puzzle. And it took me a while to figure out what was going on, and a hell of a lot of research, which I did in my own time. And I think that in 2015, when the Teaching Council of Ireland invited me to speak on such matters at their annual conference, it provided me with I suppose, the motivation to write a paper and to catalogue the scientific findings at that point, and the current version was updated in 2019.
Right. So you're referring to, of course, the critical review of digital technology in education, that should give policymakers and educators pause.
Exactly. Yeah, and in it, I'd say, well, technology does bring benefits into society and in the classroom, but like all technologies, it does have a dark side. It does have a downside.
Sure.
And it's not as, and the people making claims for its efficacy in education, have a lacuna or a blind side to the downside or its limitations, right, which are significant.
Absolutely. So we'll get to these. Now, Simon, you coming from the cold face of education, as it were, at a primary level. What are your views? What are your observations against the backdrop of your studies and your guidance of educators these days in digital technology in education?
Hi, Teresa, and thanks very much for having me on your webinar, and really interesting topic. One I really enjoy talking about. My background is in digital technology as well. I qualified as a computer scientist back just at the turn of the millennium, but carried on, I suppose, after I didn't really work for very long in technology, but became a teacher around 2002, 2003, and very quickly found myself sort of in the midst of that big transformation from, let's say, the generation before technology in education to the I suppose generation after technology, which was around, I suppose, the mid noughties, let's say, when I think 2005 there was a crux where technology just wasn't used in primary schools. And kind of beyond around 2008, almost every classroom had the use of technology in it on a daily basis. So it was a very quick, but also very slow beginning. But once it kicked off, it kind of kicked off quite quickly. But I suppose coming from the technology background, I absolutely would agree with Tom's observations that technology is just not a silver bullet as for education. It has its place. It can be a fantastic tool to do things that you can't do without it. But it also isn't a replacement for the things that you could do without it. If that sentence makes any sense.
A healthy balance you would advocate.
I've been describing technology. I know the various people in power, the government and NCSC or NCTE or whatever they're called now, would call it a resource. I would say more as a methodology, and I feel any methodology, if overused, doesn't work. But particularly, so I kind of feel it's when used well, it can be good for learning, but it isn't, as Tom's saying, the magic solution either. It does have that dark side.
I suppose really it is the tool. It is a tool as opposed to the master. But as I'm sure on your staff, you've got that intergenerational gap between those longest standing members of staff and those newcomers, and you begin to see the change even in teaching, approaches to teaching among our young, that's beginning to take root. Yeah.
Yeah, I would not in a good way. I would see the reliance on technology from some younger staff to be slightly worrying. That, I mean, I remember when I started teaching, if the internet, if we had internet at all, but if the internet broke down, it might not be noticed for days. But within 30 seconds of the internet going down in the school, it's almost as if some teachers are helpless. And I mean, I'm not saying they are or anything like that, but there is a bit more panic that what are we going to do, kind of thing. But at the same time, the technology that's being used, and I'm not saying in my particular school, but just generally across the board, what I notice is that technology is still quite down in the lower end of what it can be doing. It's still used almost like a television, rather than a learning. I see it like, I don't know if you, you probably both remember Bosco. I see it almost like the magic door. You can bring you places virtually without actually being there. But beyond that, I mean, there's still a lot of work to be done in educational technology in terms of how we use it well. And although technology is being used a lot, I kind of wonder whether it's being used well. Yeah.
Sure. So maybe we'll dive a bit deeper with you, Tom. You cite multiple pieces of research around the whole area of microwave radiation, the ill effects of exposure by young children to Wi-Fi, for instance. What are the key pieces of research findings that you feel need to be highlighted?
Yeah, as a technologist, in a former incarnation, I was a satellite and microwave radio communications engineer. I was operating on the belief that the standards arrived at by the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers and other bodies were fit for purpose. And in discussing the digital education piece in 2015 at a conference with the Chief Risk Officer of a financial institution, he was a technologist himself. He pointed out, he felt, he was of the opinion that the real danger to the health and safety of kids in the classroom wasn't the digital technology itself per se, but the Wi-Fi that was increasingly being used at that time. And, you know, I shook my head in disbelief because I've been teaching my grandkids how to use technology, and they could switch on the Wi-Fi at home and do wonderful things. However, when I began to look at the scientific literature on this, I was appalled. It took me nearly 4 years to be confident enough to speak in public about it. It is a multidisciplinary body of research, which involves contributions from epidemiologists, professors of medicine, professors of physics and physics researchers, biology, chemistry. And so I became part of a group of independent international scientists focusing on this. And to cut a long story short, it does, and my expertise in risk ran the Ireland's Governance Risk Compliance Technology Centre once upon a time. It does pose a risk to the health and well-being of children in the classroom and in the home, and that's been increasingly recognised by health authorities and governments across the developed world. And the concern is there, but as with climate change, as with smoking, as with just about everything else, which has a significant economic impact, not only for governments in terms of tax revenues and their digital strategies, but also industry. And we're talking about a multi-trillion-dollar industry where the business models of about every major corporation on the planet depends on digital technology. The last thing they want is for concerned scientists, of which there are thousands now, and a significant body of research up to, in terms of a very important biological condition called oxidative stress. 90% of the scientific studies find that exposure to wireless technology frequencies like Wi-Fi causes an increase in oxidative stress in the cells of humans, and in particular children. So if one were to adopt the precautionary approach in all this, classrooms would be wired, not wireless. And it is a significant issue because the way I look upon it is that the classroom should be a haven for children. Unfortunately, for most of them in the home, they're going to be exposed to this because of the role of wireless technology in modern life, and there's nothing we can do about that. I'm not saying we should go back to the dark ages, but we need to be risk aware, and we need to be especially aware of the risk to the children and to indeed fetuses in terms of their exposure at important junctures or stages in their physiological and neurological development, because the science is very clear in this. Exposure to weak fields of radio frequency radiation from wireless technologies does impact the central nervous system of developing children and also adults. And the mechanism through which it operates is oxidative stress. And as I said, 90% of studies on the relationship association between exposure to wireless radio frequency radiation such as Wi-Fi and biological responses in humans points to an adverse biological effect.
But
And
these are
that's unassailable.
That's fact, yeah. But so is it a case of capitalism trumping common sense? Are the findings, they're there, but are they being ignored?
I think, if we look at asbestos, and we all know it causes asbestosis and various forms of cancer, unfortunately, it's only a very small proportion of the population who would be exposed, publicly exposed, mainly occupationally exposed. And it took nearly 70 years for, even though the dangers were known at the end of the 19th century and the risks were known, and well into the early years of the 20th century, it wasn't until about 70 odd, 80 years where asbestos was banned effectively for use. And now an old building that's being renovated, there's a big health and safety issue. Well, does it have asbestos? But you can look at many environmental toxins, and the same story is there. Business interest, the interest of industry, will fight tooth and nail. If the risks, the best way to explain this is we also have natural problems, the problems that health problems that occur naturally, or from a range of environmental toxins. The problem is these things already exist. So 5% increase or 1% increase from say 10% to 11% affecting general population barely moves the needle, right? If it went from 0 to 1% to 5%, then it would be very noticeable, and there would be cause for public action. But unfortunately, that's not the case here. But the truth, like everything else, the truth is there, and it will out eventually. And I suppose in 10, 20 years' time, we'll be looking back on this and shaking our heads in disbelief. I'm still alive in 20 years' time. I have colleagues in the European, formerly of the European Environment Agency, and they wrote a very important series of papers and research monographs, late lessons from early warnings. And we have our early warnings here, for the last 20 years in terms of Wi-Fi. And, the consequences for society, because everybody's exposed, not just with asbestos or tobacco smoking, particular segments of the population, everybody's exposed now. So we're going to wait until one UK senior civil servant observed to a concerned scientist in the UK a couple of years ago. He said, before the government would do anything in this, you need the bodies to be piling up in the hospitals.
Wow.
And that's the official.
That's stark. And if you consider the pace of change these days, particularly with lockdown and COVID-19, etc., one wonders, has the horse bolted? Will it ever be halted? I mean, the asbestos problem pales in comparison in terms of magnitude.
Like the other physiological and psychological downsides of digital technology, and particularly in education, we need to manage the risks. And this is the message I want to get out there, right? We need to understand what the issues are. We need to manage the risks for our children and take informed decisions.
Sure. Right. Well, we go a little bit deeper into that after I've heard from Simon. Simon, speak to me a little bit about your research in technology and education. What were your findings?
Well, my own research really had, I suppose, had nothing to do with Tom's research at all. I mean, I bow to his expertise there in terms of the risks of Wi-Fi and things like that. I mean, I suppose my research really was more about how effective technology could be as a teacher. In a way, I was trying to prove myself out of a job in a way, but thankfully my research was inconclusive, which is good. But I just going in light of what Tom's was saying there. I mean, it's a really I've heard of this research. I think there isn't a school in the country that wouldn't have got a leaflet over the last 15, 20 years around, you know, the dangers of Wi-Fi signals and this kind of thing. And I suppose I'm in a situation where I don't know what we can do about it. You know when something is now so ubiquitous, you know, it's so ubiquitous that you get memes on the internet extending Maslow's, you know, theory, where the bottom rung is now Wi-Fi. You know, that's the most basic need of human existence. And you know, like, where do you go when people, you know, I mean, they're half joking only, you know, they're not actually fully joking when they put that down. You know, that they can't, you know, they'll live without air and water, but you know, but when it comes to Wi-Fi, they can't. And where do you go from there? That's kind of I suppose the question I'd ask, almost, you know, not just as a human, really, more so than anything else.
Do you find that, for instance, you're receiving advices from the Department of Education or Health and Safety Authority as to how best safeguard the health and safety of not alone the children, but the teachers in the school building and in the rollout of digital technology?
Not really, no. I don't know how seriously you know, the Department of Education would take that research. I don't know if it's reached them in any way. I'm sure I see no reason why it shouldn't have, or anything like that. But I suppose, again, as you probably know yourself, the Department of Education takes a fairly hands-off approach to managing schools in any way, shape, or form, and it's usually up to individual boards of management to take the heat.
Yes, that dichotomy between the department being the paymaster and the boards being the employer, etc., it tends to come down to local action, doesn't it? But it would appear to me that it really rests with educators starting from the bottom up and beginning to appraise themselves. And let's say, for instance, I believe the health and safety statement for schools now carries an element on mental health. Perhaps safety in the use of digital technology should sit in right there as well. What do you think, Simon?
I don't see any reason why not. I mean, we do have you know, acceptable usage policies for technology, which might be more appropriate there if there was to be something in there, and that does talk about safety when it comes to internet usage. But I think it's more so not to do with physiological safety, but more to do with how the technology is being used from a I suppose educational perspective point of view, rather than a kind of a health point of view, I suppose.
Sure. Now, it strikes me when Tom is speaking, we talk about the health of young children, and obviously the plasticity of the brain and their skulls in development, and even the skeleton of the adult and its developmental stages, and it's the point at which it solidifies. What impact that all has even on female teachers who may be pregnant, or teachers per se, the impact of Wi-Fi in a school. And it would have been brought to my attention in the past by a person who's involved in detox of buildings, that the Wi-Fi, the strength is often far more than it's required in schools. Do you think principals and teachers are aware of this?
I don't know, to be honest with you, Teresa. I honestly don't know. I couldn't even hazard a guess. I mean, as I said, it's certainly not the first time I've been made aware of it. There was a group of people around Carlo about 10 years ago, kind of sending leaflets out to schools, you know, basically saying, you know, switch off your Wi-Fi's in school and all that kind of stuff now. Sure. And perhaps maybe the reason they may not have been taken seriously, let's say, by schools might have been I suppose it's not what you say, it's how you say it. Might have been the problem there.
The block, yeah. So it's really in its infancy there. There's a lot of work to be done, it would appear. Tom, bringing all of this home to our particular education setting here in Ireland, first level, second level, third level, where the emphasis is ramping up on digital technology without any solid proof that it does enhance outcomes in terms of learning for the student. What, in your opinion, are the screen's Achilles heels that you referred to in that paper that is the subject of our discussion this morning? What's the Achilles heel of digital technology? For instance, the impact on sleep disruption among our children.
Yeah, well, like everything else, a lack of knowledge in physics and biology. The particular technology that we now use in all our screens is based on light emitting diodes, LED. And these emit in normal use, these emit in general use, light in the blue light spectrum, white blue light as we call it. And that has, and it's a natural occurring light as well. It helps regulate our circadian rhythm, in other words, our sleep patterns. And there is a natural cycle of exposure to that light in the summer and the winter. However, the light we get from our screens is artificial. And what it does from a regular exposure, even up to and over just 1 hour of exposure in the evening, is it suppresses the body's production of melatonin. All of this is a scientific fact, right? It's not up for debate. It's well known.
Proven fact.
Now, interference in body's production of melatonin, all things being considered, affects sleep and sleep patterns. Melatonin is also a vital antioxidant in the fight against disease in the immune system, in strengthening the immune system, ensuring proper cellular and mitochondrial functioning. And of course, as such, it regulates oxidative stress. I don't want to go back to that one again, but more importantly, the issue here, right, is that using screens in the classroom is fine during the day. Not ideal for other reasons, because the screen has also been found to, in strong levels of light from the screen, but also in very, very low levels of light, to affect vision at a physiological level, right? And over time. So much so that one Chinese district, right, has banned the use of screens in class because there's a high incidence of myopia in certain communities in China, and in this regional community is quite high. And they found that using screens increased the incidence and severity of myopia. So there are two issues here. One is computer vision syndrome, and in the eyes, the developing eyes of young children, they shouldn't be using these devices at all. And the second, of course, then is the over-reliance on devices like tablets, iPads. I don't want to single out Apple, but any screen at all in the evening where kids are reading from them, it's going to interfere with their sleep patterns. Now, sleep is very important, as we all know. It's a critical element or factor in learning, because it is through sleep that we lay down the memories and the learning experience and knowledge and skills that we develop during the day. If sleep is disrupted, learning is disrupted. Sure. So it is somewhat paradoxical, but nonetheless, whatever one may argue about likes of Wi-Fi, this is unequivocal. If we expose our kids to too much screens, it interferes absolutely with their sleep. It interferes with adult sleep, let alone say kids, right?
So the habits developed, like hopping into bed with the iPad to go through, even children or adults looking at screens before they try to go to sleep, is a bad idea.
It's a public health problem. I'll tell you why. A report from Chu et al. 2014. Short short-term sleep deprivation affects cognition, vigilance, mood, behavior, ability to learn, immune function, melatonin, and general performance. More seriously, epidemiological studies associate poor sleep with long-term outcomes such as diabetes, obesity, depression, hypertension, and general mortality from all causes.
Wow.
I'm sorry, right? Kids should not be using screens to the extent that they are today. And we take it in, every time they sit down in front of a television now, it's an LED screen. So they go from television, personal devices, learning devices. And as I was saying earlier, I believe that schools should be a safe haven. They should be, ideally, a screen-free zone, except when the screens are being used for educational purposes.
At critical stages where the brain is in formation and the wiring of the brain is taking place, etc., they're really not being wired for long-term learning and retention and recall.
No, and this is just issue number one with the screen.
Mm-hmm. So, Simon, what are your observations? Do you find that students are more distractible, find it more difficult to concentrate in class, etc., as you see the rise in the use of screens among the very young?
Yeah, I mean, there's absolutely nothing I'd disagree with there from Tom. I'm a dad as well as a principal to a young child. He's 6, and there is no way he was getting a screen in his hands until he, until we really couldn't, not give him a screen. He didn't watch TV at all until he was about 3. He didn't touch a tablet before the pandemic, really, because and we could see, I mean, very immediately, like how his mood changed after using a tablet for doing his work in school and things like that. There's a certain addiction there that no one, I don't think anyone could really deny. I mean, look, I mean, I think it comes, I mean, back a generation or two ago, we would have looked at TVs as a good babysitter. I think people are looking at tablets as a good babysitter in a way, and the balance of having that time. They were very time poor. The balance of actually, you sort of almost close your eyes and your ears to the downside of these things. So I mean, I absolutely, it's the fact that it's unquestionable, in terms of the research that's out there, it's true. I mean, I'm shocked by people who bring their phones to bed and things like that. I mean, my the bedroom has to be a screen-free place if nothing else, and that's just through doing absolutely no research, just as someone who kind of, I remember I think it was Steve Jobs said, like, he didn't allow his daughter to use his iPad, and it kind of said a lot to me. I think people who are involved in technology know this, innately. I mean, it couldn't make sense, it doesn't make sense otherwise. Anyway, that's that bit of it. But as an educator in the education field, again, I mean, I can't see how a classroom should use technology or should use a screen unless it's for a educational thing that you can't do without it. The only reason really to use a screen isn't to replace something you could learn without a screen. In my opinion, I mean, I think it's.
But the way education is going, rote learning is sort of a bad word anymore. There's got to be room for rote learning, would you think?
I mean, it can be. I don't know. I mean, I think every type of learning has its place. I think rote learning. It depends on the child and how best they learn, whatever that might be. I mean, some children learn well through rote learning, some children don't. And I mean, it's up to the educator to find the way that suits the child best. I mean, I'm a terrible rote learner. I've always have. I don't know how I got through the education system, but there we go. But there are people that are, so I don't know if technology. Technology is brilliant for rote learning. To be honest, it's probably it's one of these great things. You can basically ask a child the same question over and over and over again, and the computer won't get bored. So I mean, it's an ideal tool for remote learning. I see technology, when technology is well, it's harder to do something that's a higher order sort of form of learning with technology, and because and that's why most software is better at lower order stuff, because it's easier to program. You know, I mean, there are some good pieces of technology for the higher order end of things, but they're few and far between. Certainly at primary level, I mean, I could count, you know, maybe on the fingers of one hand, you know, software or apps or whatever that are good educational tools.
So there's a whole area there for educating educators on what to use and what not to use. But in terms of the role of the educator in alerting parents to the downside of overdependence on screen, do you see there's a role there for educators?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's sort of sneaked into the SPHE curriculum in the last few years. You know, there isn't a school in the country that hasn't brought, I suppose, what you call an internet safety person into the school, and the good ones will talk about screen time, as I mean, which seems to be the colloquial term for it, and the dangers of too much screen time, and how often a child, you know, should be or could be, or whatever the word is, using a screen and for a reason, as well as then going down the road of, you know, the actual.
And do you find they're well attended, these presentations? In my experience, I found them very badly attended, particularly by younger parents.
Yeah, I mean, the trouble with a lot of these things is that the people that need to be there never come, but the people that don't need to be there do need to be there. But, and I think that's with anything, unfortunately, when it comes to, I mean, people are very time poor, and people may have to make choices about what they attend in their own time. In some ways, if you're trying to reach parents at schools, it can be quite difficult, and your job in a way. I mean, the only thing I can compare it to is when we're trying to do food education at the moment. You know, we've sort of messed up the last generation in terms of you know, we can't, you know, parents convenience food and all that kind of stuff is ubiquitous, and you're what we're trying to do now is, okay, let's forget about the last generation. Let's teach children about where food comes from, how to grow food, so that they don't actually mess up the next generation. So in a way, you know, it could be the same sort of theory when it comes to these screens, that we've had a generation that had no idea what we were doing. We probably made a mess of things. So let's get this generation that we actually have some sort of control over in terms of what we can, you know, educate them to.
But we really need a conversation to start, don't we? You bring to mind Tom's reference to the Waldorf schools in your paper. Tom, would you like to explain what the Waldorf schools are?
Just to pick up on a point that Simon made there, right? To my students, right? The first thing in the introductory lecture to my undergraduate and postgraduate students, I referenced Daniel Levitin's book, The Organized Mind. It should be recommended reading for every parent and every child in a digital age. It explains a lot of, you know, the neurological and psychological impacts of digital technology, but also, and most importantly, provides them with sound advice and coping mechanisms in order to maximize the use of digital technology while minimizing any the very real and possible side effects. Now, to the Waldorf schools, I became interested in them, you know, again through my literature research in that. There were comments made that they were very popular in Silicon Valley with the executives of the technology firms, and they're not cheap. I think they cost up to $50,000 a year per seat, and they cover primary and secondary school education. But at primary level, the classroom is technology free, and is introduced gradually and applied at secondary level in order to, I suppose, teach kids, you know, adolescents, how to deal with the technology and how to use it productively and wisely. But the important thing is that the primary school domain is technology free, and their learning is experiential. and through activities and so on, all the good things that I suppose in a resource-constrained public school environment, we do not have those resources, even though they are the ideal things that we need at primary level, and that's from my perspective. So every school should be a Waldorf school, but we don't have the resources. Now, having said that, I do believe, on the plus side of technology. I mean, when I introduced it back in the 90s in UCC, it was computer-based training back then, and it was very focused and very on task. And there was no opportunity to go off and look at Instagram or Facebook or TikTok or any of these other things.
So we need to rein it in, yeah.
And this is the whole thing. It was on task. You completed a series of tasks, and then you were tested on your learning. Very simple and very straightforward. But I've often, the type of technology topics I teach, can't really be imagined. And I knew that, through advances in gaming and so on and so forth, and this could be useful at primary school level as well, to have the technology to demonstrate, say, the complex interaction of either teaching technology and computers, the interactions between computer elements or body elements, and perhaps even construct games. The one thing that they like playing is games. And if you can gamify the educational experience for particular purposes, for things that they can't really learn or imagine using traditional methods, which should be used primarily in primary school. Technology can make a huge contribution to human imagination and understanding, but in a very controlled and limited way.
Right. So it's coming to mind that there's a real need to educate educators on the possibilities with technology in a balanced type of way.
Yeah, and as someone pointed out, when I did the last version of this paper, there was something like over 200,000 educational apps in the Apple Store. There are around 7,000 Google, right? And it's probably increased dramatically. And the point I make in the paper is that I'm not sure. And we have our own center. There was another technology center in the technology center program based in TCD and based on developing educational technology solutions. But these tended to be targeted at more kind of occupational level, learning experience. And it works very well there with committed professionals, self-driven, on task, focused, blah, blah, blah. But the one thing I noticed is that there was a lack there was efforts to be, for psychologists to become involved to actually test learning outcomes using these things. But from my experience at least, and I welcome somebody to point out applications that have been tested scientifically to deliver the type of outcomes that their inventors, innovators, people putting them in the market claim to have.
Yeah.
And it's remarkable that the people who've been affected by the lack of functioning and the people who are going to be impacted by these things not doing what they say to do are young children, and therefore there should be scientific evidence produced to show that these things work and benefit without side effects. You think of anything else that we give our kids has to be tested and has to be shown to minimize possible side effects, but not so in EdTech.
So if it goes untracked for a decade, 2 decades, the horse has bolted, really, hasn't it?
Well, yeah, and look, it'll be a lot of investment in public finances and time and effort. And if it's not producing the type of outcomes that its innovators and inventors claim, and benefits,
time to review.
It's a waste of time, and it's a loss. We're losing a generation. And as I say in my paper, right, the importance of reading from paper the importance of writing. Just last week, when I was speaking, we had a meeting about our online experiences during the pandemic, and it became clear that most of our students were using pen and paper to take notes in online lectures. They weren't typing, they were taking notes. And that is key, because the student, and in order to do that, of course, they had to learn how to write in the first instance, how to summarize their thoughts by interpreting what lecturers like myself are saying, and then take notes accordingly. Of course, the fact that the lectures are recorded, they go back and check, but unfortunately, if they're using the videos as note-taking devices, it has been shown scientifically that watching a video gives a false sense of security to the learner, and they're not actually learning as much as if they actually took notes, because of the neurological circuitry that's engaged in the act of writing. And there's a whole area of science called haptics of writing, and it's very important. And seeing as I'm on that topic, I ran a research center for many years, PhDs, postdoctoral researchers, and research fellows, and they all have one thing in common: they used their pen and paper. These were scientists engaging in research on artificial intelligence. So when they're writing out the code and ideas, pen and paper.
Yeah,
that's it.
I remember being in Canada 2 years ago and sitting beside a professor of education, and he told me the jury is out on whether children need to learn to write anymore. And I was shocked. And he said, well, they can key. But I said, hold on here. And we had the debate, And I mean, I note in your paper, you talk about the pen being mightier than the keypad, and it brought back that conversation to me. But in terms of hand-eye motor coordination, precision in using, in holding the pen, etc., and the knock-on effects for so many other activities we engage in as humans who have evolved to this point, I think it would be a retrograde step to pull back on the writing. And that whole thing of graphology, which is big in France, even in the legal system, it's so important, and it gives gravitas to that notion of the need to write to embed and to own a piece of information. So how do you find it, Simon, at the coalface with the students? Do you find that they are more reluctant to write since the digital technology is coming more to the fore?
Not right now, no. I must say, just the primary level, I mean, thankfully, and maybe purely by accident, there's been, moves, certainly at infant level, to a much more creative and play-based sort of learning atmosphere. And I can't, and I imagine, based on the research of Waldorf Steiner and all that, Montessori, all the various things, that like most of infant education is screen-free in terms of the children's use of it.
The Ashter, you're referring to the Ashter program,
the Ashter framework, exactly. And it's good. That I would see that as a good thing, because children aren't, children are role playing, being in, let's say, various situations, post office vets, whatever. But they're not on a, there's no, they're not on the working computer or anything like that. They have the pens, they have colors, and they're using their hands all the time. And they are, I don't think I've seen, certainly at the early primary years, technology for inputting anything, taking over the handwriting and things. I was nodding along while you were saying you were having this debate with someone who said, like, the pad is going to take over the pencil or the pen. But there's people arguing that even the keypad is going to be obsolete within 10, 15 years, and we'll all be talking to our devices, and we won't need keyboards at all. But that's here nor there. I think I think it would be a disaster if writing using the pen died off. I'm a writer. When I'm not being in this job, I'm a writer myself. And I always find, if I'm starting anything, any piece of creative work or anything like that, if I start on my laptop, the stuff I produce just isn't as good. You know, and certainly if I make a mistake, I erase it and it's gone. Whereas if I'm writing, I might have to cross out my mistakes, but they're still there and I can see them and I can come back to them. You know, and there's all these other, I mean, these are just, I mean, I'm not talking as a scientist here at all. You know, more, you know, there's probably scientific stuff around that, but I mean, just from a pragmatic or a practical kind of level, you know, I do see all this. I just, as well as that, I mean, I think one of the powers of technology, though, when it does come to it, is, you know, I think technology replacing writing doesn't work. But the idea that Tom touched on there around gamifying and creation, I love the idea of, I suppose my bias is I loved, when I was doing my studies, Seymour Papert was my hero. I loved his theories. You know, the idea of building and constructionism. I loved all that. I don't know how popular it is these days, but I loved them at the time. But the idea of creating using technology and constructing things, so building blocks of like whether it's Lego or whether it's using adding in technology into that, and then the idea of Second Life and the idea of Minecraft and all that that's kind of appeared. I see that as good technology use, but I'm not quite sure how it fits into the primary curriculum, let's say. But you know, I see those as I suppose seeds of ideas that might, you know, give a role to technology, and if we're going to give a positive role to technology into the system. But certainly just replacing things like writing or learning, you know, your basics. I don't see them as good use of technology.
Now, Tom, I refer to Marianne Wolf's work on Reader Come Home. Will the next generation, she asks, adept at multitasking and quick access to multiple sources of knowledge, fail to fully develop their own deep reading processes and be more exposed to false information? So we've been speaking about the writing. Let's now look at the reading. So in light of this, in your own research, does this prospect give us cause for concern going forward?
Right from the outset, using internet technology and hypertext links and, you know, which offered the opportunity for the reader to click and go off task and be distracted. That's one issue. The other issue is that, and this is the whole Nick Carr's book, and he was the editor of Word magazine, which was the de facto, you know, I suppose, popular press, computer-oriented, serious research, but also popular items. So he unplugged himself for 6 months to write The Shadows, and he was citing research even back then that the way we read on screen is we just skim. We don't read deeply. We don't reflect. We don't annotate. We don't underline. We can do that, but we don't do it. You know, research done certainly at third level would indicate that those who read, and even beyond that, back down to this research in France and in Norway as well, that demonstrates that reading from a paper medium is much more preferable by many students than reading from screen, and that they perform better in terms of assessment of their learning outcomes.
Sure.
Now, quite aside from the other issues with you know, the physiological side of screen reading, it's the whole skimming over of things, and introduce, you know, whenever I meet practitioners, and when I say about practitioners here now in the financial industry and the legal industry, and I used on a regular basis internationally engage them, I'd always ask them how they found their intake of graduates and undergraduate students. And the global head of legal services in one of the big four, whom I met just 2 years ago, answered that question quite lawyers have to read deeply. They must, but the devil is in the detail, in legal contracts and regulations. And he had two reasons in terms of his hiring practice. He found that females, for example, female lawyers were much more attentive to detail and managed to stay on task much better than their male counterparts, who are more easily distracted by their online activities and experience. And because his clients depended on very accurate assessments and policy documents, 80% of his hires, right, of his staff were female. Now, so what that indicates to me, right, is that people are being affected by digital technologies, that males are perhaps more prone because they're more easily distracted. And maybe that's a function of our biological history in the way we developed. Because being distracted was very important in survival context. To be able to stay on task while hunting is important, but you also needed to capture other signals. And, like a snake hanging from a tree that you might walk into and you get bitten and you're dead, or maybe a predator or another hunter from an opposing tribe or whatever. You need to be attentive to all details. So what has our prehistoric or historical brain or brain as it evolved, right? Evolved for a totally different set of scenarios, right? So, when you're on screen and reading on screen, it's fine. Like in my computer-based training days, you could only run one application at a time. There was no emails, there was no instant messages, there was none of this distraction, right? And the other thing that people don't realize with the human brain, and it's why primary kids, and I was a terror when I was in primary school, with daydreaming, right? Our brains have evolved, they're energy intensive, right? They consume 20% of the energy in our body, right? So we are wired to switch into a wandering mode as much as we can in order to avoid concentration and using those important calories.
That's the system 1 and system 2.
System 1 and system 2. Yeah. So the thing is, these digital technologies, and neuroscientists know this, right? Are not only are they addictive in terms of mind wandering and straight going off task, but all of that impacts our ability to read and stay on task, right?
Yeah.
Because we're offered with very easy opportunities for screen swapping and checking.
Distractibility kicks in.
Yeah.
And in terms of skimming in education, I'm conscious of time here now. And in terms of skimming, what are your observations, Simon? Myself, as a mother of 20-somethings, who say, don't get too deep into that. People only skim. My age group only skim. They do 3 or 4 lines. Do you see that emerging among the seniors in your primary school, for instance?
Yeah, I don't know. We actually teach skimming as a reading skill at primary level. So maybe we need to reverse there in the education system. I mean, I would definitely be guilty of skimming personally when there's a long document. I mean, I suppose it depends on the document, reading for purpose and all that kind of stuff, of what skill you use to do it. But yeah, I mean, I think technology has transformed the way we read anyway, particularly with hyperlink things. Do you know that you are that traditionally reading was you start at the start and you go to the end and you might be flicking pages maybe, and it took a long time. Whereas reading, in a way, is quite different. I mean, it's quite accepted to hop from one place to the other, but what you're pulling in is probably, I mean, evidently couldn't be as deep as if you're distraction free. And I think it's the distractions and the ease of distractions that make more difficult. I mean, I think people who have Kindles seem to be able to read fairly fairly all right, because there's nothing, you can't flick over, hit Alt Tab
Yes,
and
that's
find yourself,
really fast. Yeah.
or there's no little red button, red little things on the notifications showing up saying, oh, by the way, look at me now, look at me. You know, there isn't as many opportunities. I mean, I think there's some technologies being developed that are trying to create that, maybe artificially, I don't know, this distraction-free idea. So, you know, I think there's that. So look, I'm aware that time is ticking, so I hope
so
you know,
we will just finish on this part. So we will return to looking at digital technology in education in a COVID world or a post-COVID world, and part 2. And thank you so much for your contribution, Tom and Simon. Very interesting and thought-provoking, and should be watched by every parent.
Thank you very much, Teresa, and thanks. Pleasure to meet you, Simon.
And you too, Tom. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you.